Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to the weekly show of What is School For? My name is I'm the CEO of Classroom Without Walls and the host of this weekly live streaming show. You can also listen to us on the audio-only podcast. Just search What is School For? On this show, I interview education professionals, teachers, parents, students, business leaders, entrepreneurs to come here to discuss, debate, and disrupt education. Our goal is to future-proof the next generation. Today, I am extremely humbled, honored, and excited to have Dr. Peter Gray on the show to talk about the differences between schooling and education, and specifically, we are going to discuss the power of self-directed education. Dr. Gray is a professor at Boston College, and he is also an author. And of one of the books that I really love is Free to Learn. It's such a great book. And he's also a thought leader in alternative education, and he frequently blogs on Psychology Today, Freedom to Learn. And over the last several years, Dr. Gray's work has made such a huge impact on what I do as an educator, as a homeschooling mom. So you can tell I'm very excited for today's interview. So you're going to walk away from today's interview with a much deeper understanding of the current education model. What are the problems? How has formal education affected our children's mental health, their curiosity, their passion, and their freedom to play? And also, we are going to discuss a better model to educate the next generation, which is self-directed education. So really excited. Make sure you stay for the entire interview. We have so much to cover. And as always, a big shout out to StreamYard for being a sponsor of Classroom Without Walls. And over the last 4 years, I have tried all the third-party tools to go live. And StreamYard is my favorite. In the comment section, there is a discount code for you to check out StreamYard for free for 2 weeks. Check it out. We are live on Amazon Live. So if you are joining us live on Amazon Live, you can directly get a copy of Dr. Gray's book. Again, I just could not recommend this book enough. So we're also live on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, Twitch. So let me know in the comment section where you guys are joining us live from. Without any further ado, Dr. Gray, welcome to the show.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. And thank you for that introduction. I feel humbled by it.
I have been waiting for today since the day I booked you to come to my show. So the honor is all mine. So I want to kick off. We have already, oh my God, quite a few people live with us. Thank you so much, everyone. We already have dozens of people live with us. And so I want to kick off today's discussion by talking about schooling versus education. So share with us, how do you define education?
Yeah, a good place to start. So, most people in our culture think of education as schooling. It's almost like synonyms. So if you were to ask somebody about their education, they would think you're asking them about their schooling. You're asking them whether they have a high school diploma, whether they've gone to college, whether they have some higher degree, and so on and so forth. So, so one way that the culture kind of defines education is as schooling. But to me, education and schooling are very different things. The way I define education is that it is everything that a person learns that enables them to live a satisfying and meaningful, and I sometimes add moral, life. I think that kind of hits at what most of us would want for our children, right? Most of us would want our children to live a satisfying, meaningful, and moral life. And if we think of education as helping children to grow up to do that, then that's sort of the definition of education. So that's the way I define education most often. There are some situations where I define it a little differently. For example, when I talk to anthropologists, I define education as cultural transmission.
Mm.
So anthropologists kind of think in broad terms about the human animal, how do we differ from other animals? What's the nature of the human being? And the nature of the human being that primarily makes us different from other mammals is that we are cultural animals. We transmit culture from one generation to the next. And we've been doing that for hundreds of thousands of years, long before we ever had school. And so another way to define education is that it's those characteristics of the human being that lead to cultural transmission. And those characteristics, if we look historically, lie in the child. It's always been the child's responsibility to learn what the previous generation knows. It's going to be important for that child to know to live in that culture. So either way that I define education, ultimately, the way I see it, um, the onus for education, the real ability for education lies in the child. It's what the child does, not what the adults are doing, that leads to education.
That is so true. I love this definition. And you also mentioned this, which is now I run my own education program. I almost chat with parents on a daily basis. And many parents still have this belief that only when my children go to a school, like a physical building, that's where learning happens.
Right.
So what do you think about this common belief or misbelief?
Yeah, well, we've all been kind of trained to believe that. But, one of the ways to get over that belief is think about how much children learn before they ever start school.
Mm.
Think about that. I used to be able to say, think of how much children learn before their age 5, which used to be when they would start school. Now, of course, many children are starting school earlier than that, unfortunately. But really think about it. I mean, children learn their whole native language from scratch. They learn an enormous amount about the human world. They are so curious. And they're constantly practicing skills. Nobody has to make those little children who are 2, 3, 4 years old learn. They're constantly learning. They learn a good share of what any human being will ever know before we ever start to systematically teach them anything. So that right off shows that education, defined as learning really important skills and knowledge for living a meaningful and successful life, doesn't require school. Every little child proves that to us. So the idea that kind of I'm promoting and many other people are promoting, what if you just let that continue and fostered it, allowed it, facilitated it rather than inhibited it?
Yeah, that is quite, when I was introduced to self-directed education, Sudbury Valley model, when I was actually doing my PhD, because I was so miserable. I was like, is that how we are supposed to learn? So I was doing research. But I think even for me, I'm not a big fan of the traditional education model. But when I was first introduced to this alternative approach, and I had lots of fear. Like a common question that I heard from parents is that, if I allow my children to do whatever they want to do all day long, especially for boys, they are just going to play computer games all day long. So have you ever heard of phrases or comments like that? So what do you say to those parents who have so much fear, even though they may know the traditional model is not working so well?
Right.
But they have so much fear embracing
Right.
this alternative model. What do you say to those parents?
Yeah, that I certainly have heard that from many, many parents. So it is interesting that people choose video games. So this is the thing, and a lot of kids do play video games, as you say, especially boys, and a lot of them can spend a lot of time playing video games. So in fact, video games have been around long enough that there are a lot of adults who grew up playing a lot of video games, right? And including some of the graduates of the Sudbury Valley School and some of the grown unschoolers that I've studied. I've talked to people who are now adults who said, I spent years doing almost nothing but video games. now I'm president of a company, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that. And something, a lot of those skills that I need in my work today, I learned playing video games.
Mm.
There was actually a study done some years ago by a major set of corporations that looked into what is it that children are doing when they're playing these multiplayer role-playing video games, and they concluded that many of the kinds of skills that are being developed are the very same skills that you need to be a leader in industry or in many other areas. So that's the first answer to that question, is it's not a disaster if your kids are playing video games most of the time. Now, if they're not getting any outdoor exercise, that's not you would hope they'll get some outdoor exercise, but most of them kind of figure out at some point that I need to get outdoor exercise. There's always been, this is not a completely new thing. There's always been a certain number of kids who, for better or worse, are just not outdoors people. They like to do indoors things.
True.
Sometimes we call them nerds, right? I mean, this is the term that's been around for some time. So even when I was a kid, I was an outdoors kid in the 1950s. I was out there fishing and playing baseball and all kinds of things. But I knew kids then, all they wanted to do was stay indoors and read. What a waste, I would think. Oh, gosh, why would anybody just want to sit indoors and read all day long? They're not getting any exercise. It's a passive thing to do. They're going to get fat. They're going to get, most of them grew up fine. They became things that require a lot of reading. Just like the kids who do a lot of video games now are growing up fine. They become people who do a lot of stuff, oftentimes that involves the same kinds of skills that they're learned in video games. The other thing that kind of complaint from parents has led me to do is, what's the actual research of the effects of video games? We have this belief in our culture that gets promoted by the media that video games have these harmful effects on children, that they cause social isolation, it causes obesity, it causes that violent video games may promote violence, that kids get addicted to video games so they can't do anything else, all these things. And so you read all this all the time and you hear all this all the time. And so I, as a researcher, when I read these things, I ask the question, well, what's the evidence for this? And as soon as I go and look for the evidence for all these harmful effects, something, it's not there. In fact, there's far more evidence for beneficial effects of video games than for negative effects.
Wow.
I've done several reviews of literature on my blog, actually reviews of reviews, because there are a lot now in the psychology publications. You can find reviews of the literature which conclude that nothing has ever been found that is better at building intelligence than video games. The first observation that led to that conclusion was the finding that kids who play a lot of video games have, on average, higher IQs than kids who don't play video games so much. And then, of course, that's a correlation. That could just be because bright kids like to play video games. So then they actually did experiments. So you take people who don't play video games, and these are mostly women and young girls, because it's hard to find boys who don't play video games, right? So you do this typically with college students. You find who don't play video games, you test them on certain cognitive abilities like spatial ability to hold a lot of information in your mind, ability to make quick and accurate judgments. You test them on these things, and then the experimental group is required to play a certain video game for a certain number of hours a week for a certain number of weeks, and the control group does something else. And lo and behold, at the end of that period, those who've played the video game are better, significantly better, in some cases far better, on those cognitive abilities than they were before. So that's just one of the kinds of studies. There was another study. Let me give you one other study, because people worry about little kids playing video games. So this was a study. The Columbia University was part of this study, along with some other universities in Europe. an international study of 6,000 children between the age of 6 and 11. And with these children, they assessed how many hours a week they're playing video games by asking their parents to estimate that. And then by asking teachers, they rated the kids, had the teachers rate these kids on things like their social competence, their emotional stability, how well they were doing in school, how bright they seemed to be. On every single measure, the kids who were playing 5 hours or more of video games a week did better than the kids who were playing less than 5 hours a week of video games. So let's stop assuming that your child who's playing video games is wasting time.
Wow, that is eye-opening. We have so many people, 50 plus people joining us live right now. Everyone is resonating. That is definitely reassuring to hear. It is also interesting because I read so many of your blog articles, and many people, parents or educators, we blame like video games or social media or like whatever. They are the reasons that contribute to today's young children's mental health issues. But you have quite a few articles and powerful studies to show us that it is actually not so much those things, but actually the way that the children are being taught in the traditional school environment that are making our children feeling anxious, feeling depressed, and even like suicidal. So I wonder if we can talk more about the dangers of the traditional formal education learning model on our children. So maybe we can start with mental health, because you have cited quite a few really big, powerful studies. I was actually surprised to see some of the studies. And so, yeah, maybe you can elaborate on that for us, Dr. Gray.
Right. So let me start this way. I've written a lot about this. This is not my own research. This is other people's research that I've brought together in various articles. But one thing that we know for sure is that over the years, over the last 50 years in the United States, or even somewhat longer, there has been a continuous increase in mental problems, mental disorders among school-age children. So the rate, based on various measures that are really very reliable measures, standardized clinical questionnaires given over the decades to normative groups of school children, by these measures, the rate, by the end of the 20th century, the rate of what today would be called major depressive disorder among school-age children was somewhere between 5 and 8 times what it was in the 1950s and 60s. Similarly, the rate of what today would be called generalized anxiety disorder is about 7 or 8 times what it was in the 1950s. The suicide rate by the end of the 20th century among school-age children was 6 times what it was in the 1950s and 1960s. This trend towards ever worse, ever bigger psychological problems for school-age children has been a continuous increase over that period of time. The data I have sort of ends at the end of the 20th century, but there are other data showing that this trend has continued and even in some ways accelerated. So the rates of depression, suicide, anxiety are continuing to go up even since the end of the 20th century. So this has been going on for a long time. Now, this coincides with, also beginning around the 1960s and continuing on until now, there's been a continuous increase in the pressure of school, more and more time kids have to spend in school, more and more focus on test scores, more and more focus on you have to not only get all A's and some, if you depending on what family you're in, but you have to get into the honors classes, you have to do all this stuff. Recess has been taken away from elementary schools or greatly cut down. Lunch hour is no longer an hour, and in some schools you're not even allowed to play during lunch hour. You just have to quietly eat your lunch and get back to work. We have made school continuously a more prison-like environment for our children. We have increased homework. Let me just give you a comparison. So I was an elementary school child in the 1950s. we had 6-hour school days, which is many schools still have 6-hour school days, but some of them now have 7-hour school days. The school year then, and I've looked at this data, on average in the United States was 5 weeks shorter than it is today. So we've had a whole month, we've taken a whole month away from summer vacation. We've taken away another week during the school year from what used to be vacation from school. Now, I said we had 6-hour school days in elementary school, and I don't remember this for every grade, but I remember it very well for 5th and 6th grade. The school I went to, 2 of those hours, 2 out of those 6 hours, we were outdoors playing. We had a half-hour recess in the middle of the afternoon, a half-hour recess in the middle of the morning, and a full hour at lunch. And we were playing without teachers telling us what to do. We could play in whatever way we wanted. We could play as children have always played, freely. So we were never in our seats in school for more than an hour at a time, right? And we did not have homework. This idea that elementary school children would be carrying books and worksheets back and forth between school and home had not yet been invented, except in a few places in the United States. New York City was ahead of the curve. They had it. But the rest of the country didn't. Kids in elementary school did not have homework. By the time you were in middle school and high school, there was some homework, but there was also a study hour in school. There wasn't so much homework. If you were reasonably bright, you could typically finish your homework while you were still in school. So when you were home, you were home. And you could play, you could explore, you could educate yourself in a real way by finding the things you like to do, developing hobbies, reading books you like to read instead of that you were forced to read. So I often say, so I had school as a kid, but I also had self-directed education because I had time for it. We have gradually taken that time away from children by increasing the burden of school, and also even when they're not in school and even when they're not doing homework, we tend to put them in adult-directed school-like activities outside of school. So that instead of just going out to play, they're on some adult-directed sports teams, or they're taking some kind of a class, or maybe they're doing volunteer work, but not because they really want to do it, but because their parents are pushing them to do it because it'll look good on their resume for getting to college.
Yes.
So this is the way we've changed the world. Now, with all that change, should it be surprising to us that children are increasingly anxious and depressed? We've taken away play, which makes children happy. The absence of play makes children depressed. There's a famous play researcher, Brian Sutton Smith, who used to say the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. So, you take away play from kids, and what would you expect? Of course we're going to get depression. Play is what uplifts children. It what teaches them resilience and so on. So we want to blame. So we see this high mental health problem. As a society, we stick our heads in the sand about any message that school could be the cause of problems. We want to come up with anything else. We want to say it's video games, or we want to say it's bullies, or we want to say it is social media, or we want to say it's bad parenting. We want to say anything other than school. But I am telling you, the majority of the problems that children are having, psychological problems, is because of the burden of school and because of the fact that we've taken away their opportunity to really be children, which is to play and explore in their own ways. One of the few ways they still can play away from adults is video games. And now we want to take that away too.
Wow, this is so powerful. I hope everyone is taking notes. And I think this is so true. When I taught in higher education for quite a few years, when I started talking about the problems of education, I got bullied, like really bad things happened to me. And I so agree, which reminds me of another book I actually just finished reading. And the author was also talking about this abnormal increasing rate of children, especially boys, who are being diagnosed with ADHD and all those problems. And he said that very few therapists or psychologists had the courage to call out school. They will just medicate the kids instead of saying that you boys are okay, but it is the school that is wrong. So why do you think we're so afraid to talk about openly discuss this like broken education model?
I wish I really fully knew the answer to that, but the only thing I can say is, first of all, there are powerful forces, including economic forces, for keeping school the way it is and for even adding more of it. Any institution, any bureaucracy wants to expand and promote itself, right? And so the school system is just like every other. They want to, and so if you have a business, you want more people in your business, and this is a monopoly business, right? I mean, this is not a business where you really have a choice of going there. So your job is you have to convince everybody this is absolutely essential. I think one of the few lessons that people really actually learn in school is a lesson that is actually not true, but people come to believe, which is you have to go to school to learn. That if you don't go to school, you're going to end up homeless. You're going to end up not being employable, and then that message gets transmuted in if you don't start school when you're 4 in preschool, then you're never going to do well later on in school. So you have to start later. If you don't go to college, you're never going to be able to get a job. So school goes on and on. If you don't make it into the honors courses and get all A's, you're not going to make it into the fancy college, and then you're not going to have a decent life. This is the message that constantly gets promoted. So everybody begins to believe that, and parents believe it, and they push their kids to it. And since we all went to school ourselves, and we all feel like it's hard for us to imagine growing up without school. So we all kind of buy into this message that school is so important. And it would create a lot of what psychologists call cognitive dissonance to believe that school is causing a lot of harm. Because we are all set on this idea that school is something with a halo around it. It is the great good. If we could only get everybody to do more schooling, we would have such a better world. Everybody believes this. But so then you get a message, and this is actual research, which shows that that the rate of suicide among school-age children is twice as high during the school year as it is during the summer when school is off. The rate of mental health breakdowns of all sorts plummets when children are not in school. The rate of mental health problems has actually gone down in the pandemic, believe it or not. The real evidence shows this because kids are not in school, despite all the problems that are present during the pandemic. So these are the things that people don't want to hear. And the press doesn't publish these because I think they know that people don't want to hear this. What people want to hear is that video games are causing all these problems, or this is that is causing all these problems. So I just think we're in a kind of cultural denial about all of this. It's a little bit like you're from China. So there was a time in China where girls of a certain social class had their feet bound. Am I right about that?
Yes, yes.
And they grew up crippled. And the belief was that if you didn't do this, then your life would be somehow ruined. You would never be a mate for, you had to cripple your daughter's feet.
That's right.
And so this was a cultural tradition that was passed on from generation to generation. Finally, China got rid of it, right? But I think that our tradition about schooling is a little bit like that.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And it takes pioneers like you and many other like leaders in this space to speak up and to talk about this. So I want to share my screen for a second to highlight some of the articles that you were talking about that I want to make sure everyone really paying attention. So this is what I discovered when I heard you, Dr. Gray, saying that teens are actually the most stressed out group in the United States. I actually couldn't believe it. I was like, wow. I actually did a survey on my LinkedIn post, and surprisingly, very few people actually see this. They thought that working professionals or single parents were the most stressed out group. But actually, according to the American Psychological Association, it is actually teenagers. And so that shows. And here's another article published on Wall Street Journal, and saying that, youth suicide rate has increased almost 60%. I was absolutely heartbroken to read this number. And I also love that I shared this earlier, and this article was so refreshing for me to read, to actually understand the correlation between school calendar and children's mental health. And when the school year is over, how children actually, their mental health overall state of well-being actually has improved dramatically. Absolutely eye-opening research. But as you mentioned, it's not very common. When you do a Google search, you really have to dig to discover researchers like that, and which is really interesting. So here's another point which I really want to discuss. Pam is also a super fan of your work, and you mentioned this a little bit, Dr. Gray, talking about grades. And I noticed that, like nowadays when I do phone calls or Zoom chat with parents, the very first sentence they tell me about their children is that my kid is like 4.0 student, is a 3.0 student. So they absolutely use grade to measure their children's success. So what are some of the side effects of this like obsession, right? This obsession with academic performance? It is really bad in the United States, but I can tell everyone it is even worse in China, Korea, India, where I had the fortune to get to know quite a few parents there. It is a lot worse than here. So share with us about the danger of this global obsession with test scores and exams.
Yeah, so you know what it is we've become obsessed with measurement and numbers, and there are some things that make sense to measure, right? And there are other things that just doesn't make sense to measure because you can't actually measure them. One of those things that it doesn't make sense to measure is education. You can't really measure education because everybody's education is different. Ideally, remember, if you define education the way I did, it's whatever you learn that allows you to live a successful and happy life and a moral life. Now, there are certain things that everybody in the same culture would probably want to learn. We would kind of all want to learn how to read and write and use numbers to the degree that we need them. But beyond that, what you want to learn for your successful and meaningful life may be very different from what I want to learn for my successful and meaningful life. So what possible sense would it make to say that you are ahead of me in your education? We're on different tracks. We're on different parts of a branch. We act as if education is a race and everybody's on the same track and who's ahead and who's behind. And we believe we can measure that with test scores. And that leads to this obsession. And what happens is education becomes more and more narrowly construed as learning whatever you need to do to pass those tests. And then, of course, people just forget it anyway after the test. So it's a meaningless race. It's an absolutely meaningless race. Now, it's interesting that what change occurred in America that led to the kind of changes? It was when the PISA exams came out, the international exams. Oh my Lord, the Chinese were outscoring us. And not only the Chinese, but all the East Asians were. Oh, how embarrassing to we in the United States. We've got to do something. Let's look and see what China is doing. And let's see if we can do the same thing. Let's have our children go to school much more. Let's drill them for the tests and so on and so forth. We weren't aware that the rate of suicide among Chinese children was even much greater than that in the United States. We now know that because there is some data on that now. So, but we decided to try to mimic. We never did it very well, but we decided to try to mimic that. And we moved in that direction. Why? So we could get test scores equal to the Chinese, right? I mean, oh, here I am, I'm blaming China. Of course, I don't mean to be doing that. I'm blaming us. Now, there's a wonderful book, and people might be interested, actually a couple of books by uh, an education professor named Yang Zhao, who actually grew up in China, and then he came to the United States, and he's been writing about education, and he's been writing comparing the Chinese educational system with the American educational system. And he talks about in his book, he presents some studies which are quite interesting. One of which, so in China, these sort of national test scores are celebrated. Whoever, the mother of the child who gets the highest score in the nation, she becomes a real celebrity, right? Because
I have real life stories to share. Yes.
Everybody knows it's the mother who made that child do that, right? So, but the child went through all of that, and so there was a study that was looking at the question, what happens? I'm hearing an echo. I don't know if anybody else is hearing it. Okay, there, the echo has gone away now. So what happens to these kids who score the highest on the exam? It turns out that they don't do very well in adult life, that the kids who score lower do better. Why? Because they've spent so much of their time preparing for tests and studying that they didn't learn the skills that are really important for success, like how to be creative, how to take initiative, how to make friends, how to work with other people. These are the skills that lead to success in life, and these are not the skills that are being tested either in China or in the United States. And you can't test for these things.
No.
So this whole testing mania is a very, very serious problem. And it is at the root of why we are overstressing our children, why we have taken away recess, why we've taken away so many of what used to be the creative kinds of things that people did in school. It used to be, that you had art classes where you could make whatever art you want, and it wasn't graded. You had times when you would decorate the classroom. You had times when the children would write stories, not for grades, but just for fun and sharing the stories, or poetry, or put on little plays. These kinds of creative things that were always kind of fun and made school worthwhile. So much of this has been taken away so that we can drill the kids on the stuff that's going to be on the tests.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. I have so many real life stories to share to back up everything you mentioned, Dr. Gray, because I grew up in that educational model. The early years was brutal. I definitely attempted to kill myself a few times because I hated my life so much, even though I was doing so well, academically speaking, my parents were proud of me. And I don't know if they still practice this nowadays in China, but when I was a student, so we have so many exams. So every time after a major exam, when you enter the school building, the big walls, the hallway will publicize every single student's grade. So you are typically being publicly humiliated in a country where academic performance means so much more than anything else. So I grew up just pretty much being humiliated, but I never learned any of those real life skills that you were talking about. I didn't know how to make friends. In fact, I hated most of my friends because we see each other as competitors. It was such an awful model. I really had to ask myself, what's the point of me learning all those math, chemistry, physics at the cost of my own emotional, physical well-being? And now I don't even use that. It's not something I'm even remotely interested in. I'm doing something completely different. And so here we have Pooja joining us live in India. So thank you for sharing your story. And she said that in most of the schools in India, more than 70% of students who scored between 50 to 80, which is not bad, in the exams are never appreciated for the efforts which make them to think that they are good for nothing. How sad is that?
It is so sad. I'm so sorry to see India going down this track ever more. I was in India a couple of years ago, and my wife has converted to Sikhism, and so we were staying on an ashram in India, and we went out for a little walk in the country. And a farmer beckoned us over, and and he just wanted to chat with us. And I sat and talked with this farmer, and I said, "So where are all the kids?" I expected to see a lot of kids out playing in India. I thought that there would be, unlike in the United States where you almost never see kids out playing, I thought I would see kids out playing. He said, oh, they're all being tutored. Even parents who can't afford it are paying for tutoring, so they'll do better in school. And then he went on. He could have given my lecture for me. He went on and he said, and they don't even care what the kids are learning. All they care about is that they're getting a high score on the test. So this is nationwide. This is occurring everywhere. How sad. How sad that we've taken away childhood from children so that we can try to improve our PISA scores.
That's right. That's right. And I remember you said that, which in my observation, I also heard this too. Even like 3 years old, 4 years old, and they will hear from their teachers saying that the report card, right? And academically behind. And like you really have to what? Oh, 3 years old, 4 years old, how can this young kid be academically behind? It is just like, and imagine parents become so stressed out, start to give those kids tutoring classes. Yeah, I mean, when I was in Korea, the students in second grade, they already started to attend the prep classes to get ready to go to an Ivy League school in the United States from the second grade. And it is actually very competitive to enter those prep schools. It's just like a very long checklist, community surveys, speaking English, and all those things. So they start to prepare the kids as young as second graders. And can you believe that? Yeah.
It's I mean, this is another of the tragic things we're doing increasingly is starting so-called academic training with younger and younger children. And there's no question about this is having harmful effects.
So here's the question asking if you have any like reading recommendations by Brian Sutton Smith.
Well, he's written a lot of books. I have to say that I love Brian Sutton Smith, but I don't always agree with him. So but he probably one of his most famous books is The Ambiguity of Play. And it's a very philosophical, kind of very interesting book about play and the various purposes that play serves and doesn't serve. But that's probably the first book I would recommend if you're interested in his writing. He has a somewhat different approach. He wasn't so much interested in play as a vehicle for children's development. He was more interested in sort of questions about what play is, what are the various kinds of purposes, and on harmful effects it has. He kind of wrote about harmful effects of play too, but he had a somewhat different definition of play than I did. So he valued play and he saw play as necessary, but and as the way I think overall he saw play as how people develop resilience, if there was some value to it. How people develop resilience, how people develop kind of creativity, kind of new ways of thinking, and that part of what he writes I certainly strongly agree with.
Yeah, I know, like this part you actually also talked about, which I also experienced, how today's college students, they have become so needy. Like you mentioned this, and I was actually afraid to give my students lower grade because I don't want them to do something to hurt themselves, which was not the case. Like 10 years ago, I have been teaching for quite a few years, but 10 years ago, if they get a B or B minus or C, they were like, okay. But nowadays, if you give the students like a C, like I'm afraid that they will like do something stupid to hurt themselves. So definitely overall, their emotional resilience has decreased so much. Do you see that?
Yes, and there's actually a lot of research showing this. This is a big problem in higher education today and colleges throughout the country. An enormous number of college students are suffering from mental breakdowns of one sort or another, way higher rates than were in the past. Now, of course, a lot of them are already coming to college with high rates of anxiety and depression, as I said before. But even those who don't have a diagnosis like that, who don't have a diagnosable mental disorder, the kinds of experiences that have always been difficult experiences become overwhelming experiences to children, to young people. These are not children, these are young adults in college. So, some years ago, I got involved with this because the head of counseling, the head of the counseling office, of the mental health department office at Boston College, had noticed that the rate of use of the mental health facilities over the 5 years that he had been there had doubled, and that people were coming for reasons that he felt they ought to be able to handle themselves. Normal kids in the past could always handle it. So you've had an argument with your roommate, or you've had a bad grade, or you break up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, or in one case, he gave an example of somebody who saw a mouse in their apartment, and this was cause for a kind of a breakdown. I mean, who wouldn't? In what kind of student apartments off campus would you not see a mouse? But these are the kinds of things he was saying was happening, and he held this meeting at which professors and counselors there were meeting to talk about this experience and what we could do about it. And there were professors saying very much what you've said. I've been teaching a long time, and for the first time, I'm really afraid to give low grades. I mean, somebody might commit suicide as a result of it. We've come to, there used to be this concept, this is, of course, a male chauvinist term, but this concept of the gentlemanly C. That was just fine. A gentleman would get a C and be happy. If you got a B, you were probably working too hard. So that has gone way out the window. Yeah, B, a lot of kids think is a failure. There are people who will say right out, but my parents don't allow me to get a B. What on earth does that mean? They don't allow me to get a B, so I can't to get a B. I have to get all A's. This is so silly. First of all, the grades are so... The truth of the matter, the grades are kind of meaningless. There's all kinds of, there are great writers out there who say, I failed my English literature course and I failed writing. I used to get F's in writing. There are great scientists out there who say, I barely made it through my science classes. There's no relationship. I mean, in fact, the people who've achieved best in the world are often the people who did worst in their grades in school. So we've got to get over this concern about grades. I think finally industry is getting over it. I think, the truth of the matter is that once you're out of college, nobody asks to know what your grades are. And so it doesn't really matter. And I think there's more and more of a recognition that grades don't predict very much. And so there are some interesting trends going on in the United States, one of which is that more and more companies are hiring people who have not gone to college, who used to require that you went to college, because they realize that going to college doesn't lead them to know any more that helps them in their job than if they didn't go to college. And so they're starting apprenticeship programs, which makes a lot more sense. And we want to train people in the particular kinds of skills that are important for a career in this area that we are in. The number of apprenticeships has doubled in the last 4 or 5 years in the United States. And so there is a movement in that direction. I think it's a very healthy movement. I think that once people realize that you can live a very happy and successful life without college, and there's also a lot of data showing that if you do go to college, it doesn't matter what college you go to. Other things being equal, you control for social class, you control for the kind of variables that, of course, if you have rich parents, you're going to that gives you a lot of advantages whether you go to college or not. But if you control for that, then it doesn't matter. If you basically take identical people who are matched in every way that you can match them. One of them has gone to Harvard or Stanford or one of those fancy colleges everybody wants to get their kids into. The other one has gone to the local state university, easier to get into, a lot less expensive. They do equally well on average in life by every measure.
Yeah, I love this. This is like music to my ears just on this show, Dr. Gray, I have interviewed at least dozens of people who either dropped out of high school or dropped out of college. They are having remarkable careers. They're happy, they're fulfilled, they're making a positive impact. And there are also cases of students that I interviewed. They hated their literature class, but now they pursue copywriting, internet marketing, copywriting, writing emails as a living, and they're making good money. They're helping others. So I love this. And I also think I love this trend you were talking about, right? Industry certifications, apprenticeships, those are really positive changes. And I know that Google launched their own career certifications to replace the 4-year college. And actually, I think you also talked about, there was a study, speaking of Google, they actually, was an interview between Google and New York Times. They actually suggested a inverse relationship between grade, GPA, grade point average, and actually innovation orientation. So which means the higher the grade, the less likely the kid is to innovate. I think more parents, educators need to be aware of that, need to hear that, and see the trends that are emerging.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, they found an inverse relationship. And it shouldn't be too surprising, because if you're the kind of person who sticks to working to get a high grade, even no matter how boring it is and how uninteresting it is, you're not probably the kind of person who's going to be an entrepreneur, who's going to go out and do something really different and innovative and be creative. Getting a high grade doesn't generally require creativity. It requires hard work at doing what you're told to do. And that's more and more true in school, even in college, than it used to be, because it used to be that more creativity was actually being required. You had to figure out how to write your own paper. You had to figure out what you wanted to write. You had to, but now the students are more or less demanding, even in college, that the professor tell them exactly what it is that they need to do in order to get the A. We've sort of made that grade so important that we can't blame the kids for that. That's our fault. We've made the grade so important that the kids feel like it's not fair if you grade them without telling them exactly what they have to do in order to get that grade. And then they go on to the career with that same mentality. So one of the complaints from people who hire young college graduates is that the college graduates don't know how to take charge of the work themselves. They want to be told exactly what to do. They've hired this person to figure out what to do. But this person says, and if this new employee messes up, they blame the boss for not telling them how to do it right. So instead of believing, I'm supposed to figure this out, that's what my job is, to figure this out, they find that hard to believe, and they don't accept that idea. And they've always been told more and more all the way through school. They've been told exactly what they have to do in order to get the grade, and they've learned that that's what life is about, or come to believe that that's true. But of course, that's not true. In real life, we've got to figure things out. And in real jobs and careers, we've got to figure things out.
Absolutely. I see that, right? Their children are so obedient. They are constantly waiting for you to tell them exactly what to do. And that is a reflection of the traditional education model, because they are always listening to the teacher, right? That's what parents are telling to our kids. Listen to the teacher, listen to the teacher.
Right.
And I think we need to disrupt and challenge that. And I want to highlight this comment from June Bea. Thank you for joining us live. And she organizes virtual online internship and paid internship programs for the kids, for high school students, to really have a taste of industry experience. And I think we need more industry leaders like her to offer students the opportunities to learn, outside the classroom. That is absolutely so critical and so crucial. So we only have a few minutes left, but I definitely want to talk more about We spend so much time talking about the problems of education, but there is a better way. And I really want to talk about the power of self-directed education. And you are such an expert. That's kind of what we follow at home to homeschool our kids. We do unschooling and to really look at what our children are telling us, what they are interested in. So Dr. Gray, can you tell us a little bit more for those people who are not familiar with this new or better approach, self-directed education? So can you give us a kind of a brief overview what it's about, and so that people can learn more about it?
Yeah, so children, my whole argument, and you can read it in my book or and elsewhere, is that children come into the world designed to educate themselves. They have these instincts that came about, that were shaped by natural selection for the purpose of education. Curiosity. All children are curious until we drive the curiosity out of them. Curiosity is is the drive to learn about the world around you, to ask questions, to figure things out. Children almost from birth on are constantly exploring the world around them, and that doesn't stop unless we stop it by putting them in school where their curiosity no longer counts. So curiosity is how children learn about the world. Play is how children practice skills. Children play at all the kinds of general activities that people need to develop. They play in imaginative ways and develop their imagination and their hypothetical thinking. They play at building things and they develop their ability to build things. They play socially and they develop their ability to get along with other people and to empathize and so on and so forth. They play physically and they develop their physical abilities. They play with language and they develop their linguistic ability. All the kinds of things that people everywhere have to learn. They also tend to play with whatever are the most important tools of the culture, which is why children in our culture today play with computers. Clearly the most important tool of our culture today. Children in a hunter-gatherer culture play with bows and arrows. Children in a farming culture play with farming instruments. Nobody has to tell them to do this. They just automatically do it. They somehow look around. They see this is this is an important tool in the culture, and I better learn how. They're not saying it in exactly those terms, but I better learn how to do this and get good at it, and they play with it. So this is children's nature. This is how, before we ever had schools, children always became educated. Now, a lot of people think that's fine and good for in the past, but this couldn't work in the present. And what my research shows, not just my research, but other people's too, shows is it still does work in the present if we provide the appropriate conditions for it. So I've studied self-directed education in two different contexts. These are the two legal ways to do self-directed education in the United States. One is homeschooling of the variety that is commonly called unschooling. I don't particularly like the word unschooling because it tells what you're not doing rather than what you are doing, right? And it sounds like you're against something, but doesn't say what you're for. I like to use the term self-directed education in the homeschooling in the homeschooling rubric. So that's so basically what this is you register your child as a homeschooler, but you aren't doing school at home. You're not doing a curriculum. You're not testing your children. You're not requiring your children to do any particular things related to their education. You are allowing your children to follow their own interests. Now, there are many thousands of children doing this kind of thing, and it's a growing number from year to year. And I've done some studies one study of graduates of this approach, young adults, not all young adults, some middle-aged adults who grew up this way, and they're doing just fine in the world. Another way to do self-directed education that's legal, not so many doing it because for most people it costs something to do this and it's not available everywhere. And that's to go attend a school that is designed for self-directed education. So these places are sometimes called schools or sometimes called learning centers, but they're not like schools as we usually think of them. These are places where kids can spend the day. There's kids of all ages, lots of people to play with, lots of things to do. But again, no tests, no courses that are required. There may be courses offered or maybe not. In some of the places, if there's going to be a course, that only occurs if the kids organize it. And generally, at least in some of these schools, these are run democratically, where the children have a full vote on all the rules that are made at the school, and there are no rules that have to do with education, with learning. So there's one of these schools was actually founded in 1968, so it's been around for more than half a century. It's got hundreds and hundreds of graduates. I, some years ago, did a study of the graduates, and they were doing very, very well in life. There are now quite a number of such schools. They're all pretty small, scattered throughout the United States and throughout the world, in countries where it's legal to have such schools. And there's evidence that this works wherever it has been tried. So and some of these schools have sliding tuition scales, so it becomes possible to enroll children who for free for families that can't afford any kind of tuition. There's a school called the Philly Free School in Philadelphia that's of this sort. There's some other schools that I'm aware of that are like this. And so it seems to work for people who, no matter from what social class they're coming, and no matter why they're coming, it seems to work. I think it works because it provides the kind of setting where children's natural instincts to educate themselves come to the fore. And you have to be a very trusting parent to either unschooling or this. You have to believe that whatever your child is doing is okay, as long as they're not breaking the laws, as long as they're not hurting anybody. You have to believe. You can't keep judging the child. Oh, all he's doing is playing video games, or all he's doing is fishing all day long, or all he's doing is this or that. You have to say, because this is often what children do. They get into something really deeply. But think about what children are learning when they get into anything really deeply. They're learning how to do deep thinking. They're learning how to really become an expert in something. And that generalizes into no matter what else you do. So this idea, what you have to do if you're going to do self-directed ed, you have to give up the idea that your child, on his or her own accord, is going to do what your vision is of what you would want your child to do. You have to say, that child's a different person from me. And that child's going to grow up okay. And I have to let that child be in charge of the decision about what my child is doing. In our culture today, where we get so many messages about controlling our children, controlling our learning, it takes a fairly courageous parent to do it. But it takes less courage today than it did in the past, because we've got the model of so many families that have now already done it. We've got the model of so many adults out there who grew up this way and are doing well in the world. And as I think that as that number continues to grow, it's going to be easier and easier for more and more parents to adopt that. Once there's more people doing it, it will also be easier in other ways for people to do it, because you'll have more centers for it. You'll begin to get public funding for it. This kind of education is actually less expensive than the coercive education of our public school system. All the Sudbury model, all the schools that I've just described operate on per pupil costs much less than public school does. This is not expensive education. Why? Because you don't need prison guards. You don't need a lot of teachers. You don't need a lot of, all this structure that is aimed at keeping kids in their seats and doing. Yet when kids are on their own, they're learning. They're learning on their own. They're learning from one another. They don't need a lot of adult time in order to educate themselves.
Yeah, and you really help them to cultivate their intrinsic desire to learn, to design their life, to design their workday. And I absolutely love this model. I also love this comment from Pam saying that, how about they spend more time in the community rather than on school campuses, right? I join communities and community surveys, and I love all those models because they do intergenerational mixed age model. When you do community service, you have that mixed age model environment, and it is so beneficial to our students so that they have this, cross-generational relationship, like practice their communication skills. It is such a great idea. And I know that we already run over time, but I definitely want to hear if you guys want to learn more about, let me share my screen. If you guys want to learn more about this like better approach, which I'm a fan of and which we practice at home, definitely make sure you check out Dr. Gray's book. So we also have so many people join us live on Amazon Live. So that's the book I featured here, Free to Learn by Dr. Gray. If you only need to enter in the search bar here, Classroom Without Walls.live, and then you will be redirected to this store and you will see this book. Definitely check it out. I have some other books here. And so maybe we can end today's interview with a quick story, because you share so many fascinating stories of children who grow up with this very non-traditional approach. Like, for example, even for the kids who are labeled having some sort of learning disabilities, but now when they are out of that formal learning environment at Sudbury Valley or unschooling, and all of a sudden they are doing better. They don't have that stress. And like, can you share some stories like with us? Because I think not many people are familiar with this type of model, and this, we were talking about fear-based parenting, and I think many parents, including myself, from time to time, I will doubt myself, right? Did I give my kids too much trust? Should I control a little bit? So give us some stories, share some stories with us, give us some hope to trust more of this alternative approach.
Yeah, well, I could tell you. So here's one of the observations that I made that led me to rethink the whole question about so-called learning disorders. So, in the United States, we've seen over the years great increases in all kinds of learning disorders. And if you include ADHD, huge increases in all kinds of so-called learning disorders. And of course, in my mind, these are for the most part perfectly normal kids who just aren't fitting into the school environment and learning in the way that works for school. And so instead of saying that school is an abnormal place for kids, we decide that the kids themselves are abnormal and need some kind of drug or something, or some kind of special training or specialty to help them out. So, but let me give you one of the first observations that I made that got me thinking about dyslexia. So dyslexia is supposedly a brain-based inability to learn to read, or a brain disorder of some sort, or whether, I guess, disorder, a brain difference that makes it very hard for children to learn how to read. The truth of the matter is nobody has ever found a place in the brain that does this. There's a lot of claims, but they're very mixed. Nobody's ever been diagnosed with dyslexia by virtue of looking at their brain. So it's just simply a hypothesis that this has to do with the way the brain is. It may very well be that there are brain differences that make people lead people to learn in different ways, and so on. But there's a growing number of people diagnosed with dyslexia. Part of the reason there's a growing number of people diagnosed with dyslexia is there's now evidence that trying to teach children to read too early, who are not ready to read, actually creates dyslexia. And I have a blog post in which I present some of that evidence. So there's more and more kids with dyslexia as we try to teach reading earlier and earlier. There's also more and more kids diagnosed with, believe it or not, dyscalculia, an inability to do arithmetic, as we teach arithmetic earlier and earlier and earlier. So we're creating a lot of these disorders. But years and years ago, when I did my first study of the graduates of one of these alternative schools, the Sudbury Valley School, and I was interviewing the graduates about their experiences at the school, their experiences before the school. And it turned out that two of the people in that study, who were former students at that school, both told me independently of one another, and they were there at different times. I don't even know if they knew one another, that they had come to the school at age 15. They'd been passed along in the public school, unable to read. Neither of them they both reached age 15, unable to read. They'd been diagnosed with dyslexia. They both told me they came to the school and within a few months they could read. And I asked them, how could that be? all these years of at a place where they actually teach reading and help you learn how to read. Now you go to a place where they don't even teach reading and nobody even cares if you can read. And suddenly you learn how to read. And both of them said in somewhat different ways, it's because they didn't care that I was able to learn how to read. The pressure was off.
Oh, wow.
The pressure was off. I didn't have to hide behind a label. I didn't have to, I could ask for some help. In both of those cases, they did ask for some help. It was nothing like the teaching of reading. It was like, it was like sitting down with somebody who's kind of showing you there's a code here, A is and so on and so forth. And they both learned to read. There was nothing wrong with their brains. They had a mental block about reading. And I'm convinced that we are creating these mental blocks. I actually have 2 or 3 recent blog posts on this that actually present some of the evidence for this. It's not just case histories like that. But that's one example of the kind of thing that I've observed in these studies. One other thing that I might say in relation to this is not an exact answer to your question, but I think it's valuable, that one of the major differences that I find between people who've grown up with self-directed education and people who've grown up with the typical schooling system is that people who've grown up with self-directed education seem to be much happier in their careers. And the reason for this is because they've had lots of time as children growing up to explore, to play, to figure out what they really like to do. And they haven't grown up in this idea that the whole goal of life is to please other people. They've grown up with the idea that the goal of life is to do things that I enjoy doing, that are meaningful, that are helpful to the world. They aren't oriented towards getting grades. And for the same reason that they're not oriented towards getting grades, they're not oriented towards high pay beyond what they really need to live a happy life, nor are they oriented towards prestige in the career. So a lot of people growing up, and I learned this when I would talk to my advisees when I was a college professor, a lot of people think that they want to become doctors or lawyers or business executives because it has a lot of prestige associated. And they also believe these people make a lot of money, which is often, by the way, not true. But so they're kind of oriented, so they're thinking of, you're always pushing up to try to get to the top of the hierarchy. They're not thinking about things like, I want to be a forest ranger, or I want to be a daycare center leader because I love little children, or I want to do, they're thinking about, what can I do that would bring me the most money and the most prestige? And they're thinking about what would be most meaningful that also fits with what I really like to do. So they're very often pursuing careers that are direct extensions of their passionate interests. Now, a lot of them do go into jobs that we think of as prestigious. There are lawyers, there are doctors, there are professors who've come out of self-directed education, but they have gone into it because they know what it is and they really want to do it. And they're happy as doctors, lawyers, and so on. But other people say, I would be happiest as a plumber, or I would be happiest as an electrician. I would be happiest as a person who has a daycare center because I just love little children. And they're not thinking that the rest of society is going to think that they haven't achieved the highest that they could achieve by virtue of striving for some career that requires more education and is higher on the hierarchy. So I think that's a real value. And if you read some of my writing, you'll see the many cases I can describe of people who are in careers that somebody who just was going to school would never have even heard of this career. But these are actually very fascinating careers. And in some cases, it turned out to be also very well-paying careers where basically the person got into this career by getting really interested in something as a child and then saying, now, how can I make a living doing this, what I love to do? Just one quick example. So one of the graduates of the Sudbury Valley School in my study years ago was captain of a cruise ship. And she just grew up loving boats and playing with boats on the school's pond. And by the time she was a teenager, she apprenticed herself to a ship captain. And, by the time she was a young adult, she was very prepared for what was her dream job of being captain of a ship herself. So, but I could tell dozens of such stories.
Amazing. I think, that's why so many young professionals, I shared the study. There was a big study from Gallup came out, I think last year. They surveyed like billions of full-time working professionals. 85% of those professionals actually hate their jobs. I mean, like hate is such a strong word, but like from what I'm hearing from you, Dr. Gray, all those kids, they have that alignment between who they are as a human being and
Right.
they co-design their life, their career based on who they are. I think that is what, as a parent at least, what I want for my kids to be happy, have that alignment between what they're doing and who they are. So that is such a perfect way to end this interview. And so thank you so much, and share with us some resources where people can learn more about you and self-directed education and homeschooling, all those things.
Well, you've already mentioned my blog that I write for Psychology Today, so people can look at that. I also I repost a lot of links to a lot of those essays on my Facebook page, and so by following me on Facebook, you can also see a lot of discussion of other people who follow me on Facebook about these issues. I'm one of the founders of an organization called the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. I stepped off the board of that a while ago, but this is an organization that has a lot of information about self-directed education, provides support for people who are going into that. So if you're interested in the idea of self-directed education, I would go to the website for the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. And there's another organization. If your interest lies more in what can you do about reforming public schools and what you can do about trying to find ways for your children to play, even if they are going to public school, find more opportunities for freedom, and then I would suggest going to the website for Let Grow. Let Grow. This is a nonprofit organization. Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids, is the president of it. I was one of the founders of it with her, and I still work with her a great deal. And we're working with schools, we're working with whole communities. We're working in some cases with state legislators to try to create the kinds of conditions that would allow children to play outdoors much more than they are today without being micromanaged by adults, and create within schools changes that bring more play, more real play into the school, and to create less emphasis on tests and test scores. There are, by the way, quite a number of schools that are working in this direction at this point, and some of them are working with us at Let Grow. So that's another organization that you might want to look at.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And everyone, definitely you should check them out and follow Dr. Gray on Facebook and read all of his articles on Psychology Today. And some of the articles I frequently go back and reread. Just especially if you are interested in learning more about education, taking the alternative approach to homeschool or raise your children in a better way. So thank you so much again, Dr. Gray. This is such an amazing interview. I had such a great time. And thank you for staying over time with us. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us live from all over the globe. We have 60 plus people joining us live. Amazing. And definitely, if you go to Classroom Without Walls .live, and where you can get a copy of Dr. Gray's book and check out some other books. And thank you so much, everyone. And I really appreciate you guys. And see you next Friday or Saturday, same time, same location. Thank you so much again, Dr. Gray.
Thank
Bye,
you. It's
everyone.
been a pleasure. Bye-bye.